Hello everyone. Developments after 1858 till independence. Indian Councils Act 1861. The 1861 Act marked an advance in that the principle of representatives of non-officials in the legislative bodies became accepted. Laws were to be made after due deliberation, and as pieces of legislation they could be changed only by the same deliberative process. The lawmaking was thus no longer seen as the exclusive business of the executive. The portfolio system introduced by Lord Canning laid the foundations of cabinet government in India, each branch of the administration having its official head and spokesman in the government who was responsible for its administration. The act by vesting legislative powers in the governments of Bombay and Madras and by making provision for the institution of similar legislative councils in other provinces laid the foundations of legislative devolution. However, the legislative councils established by the Act of 1861 possessed no real powers and had many weaknesses. The councils could not discuss important matters and no financial matters at all without the previous approval of government. They had no control over budget. They could not discuss executive action. Final passing of the bill needed Viceroy's approval. Even if approved by the Viceroy, the Secretary of State could disallow a legislation. Indians associated as non-officials were members of elite sections only. Indian Councils Act 1892. In 1885, the Indian National Congress was founded. The Congress saw reform of the councils as the root of all other reforms. It was in response to the Congress demand that the legislative councils be expanded that the number of non-official members was increased both in the central, imperial and provincial legislative councils by the Indian Councils Act 1892. Legislative Council of the Governor General or the Indian Legislative Council as it came to be known was enlarged. The universities, district boards, municipalities, zamindars, trade bodies and chambers of commerce were empowered to recommend members to the provincial councils. Thus was introduced the principle of representation. Though the term election was firmly avoided in the Act, an element of indirect election was accepted in the selection of some of the non-official members. The members of the legislatures were now entitled to express their views upon financial statements which were henceforth to be made on the floor of the legislatures. They could also put questions within certain limits to the executive on matters of public interest after giving 6 days' notice. Indian Councils Act 1909, popularly known as the Morley Minto reforms, the act made the first attempt to bring in a representative and popular element in the governance of the country. The strength of the Imperial Legislative Council was increased. With regard to the central government, an Indian member was taken for the first time in the Executive Council of the Governor General. Satyendra Prasad Singha was the first Indian to join the Governor General's or Viceroy's Executive Council as law member. The members of the Provincial Executive Council were increased. The powers of the Legislative Councils, both central and provincial, were increased. Under this act, the real power remained with the government and the councils were left with no functions but criticism. The introduction of separate electorates for Muslims created new problems. Besides separate electorates for the Muslims, representation in excess of their population strength was accorded to the Muslims. Also, the income qualification for Muslim voters was kept lower than that for Hindus. The system of election was very indirect. Thus, the representation of the people at large remained remote and unreal. Government of India Act 1919. This act was based on what are popularly known as the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms. In August 1917, the British government for the first time declared that its objective was to gradually introduce responsible government in India, but as an integral part of the British Empire. The Act of 1919 clarified that there would be only a gradual development of self-governing institutions in India and that the British Parliament and not self-determination of the people of India would determine the time and manner of each step along the path of constitutional progress. Under the 1919 Act, the Indian Legislative Council at the centre was replaced by a bicameral system consisting of a Council of State upper house and a Legislative Assembly lower house. Each house was to have a majority of members who were directly elected. So direct election was introduced, though the franchise was much restricted, being based on qualifications of property, tax, or education. The principle of communal representation was extended with separate electorates for Sikhs, Christians, and Anglo-Indians besides Muslims. The acts introduced diarchy in the provinces, which indeed was a substantial step towards transfer of power to Indian people. The provincial legislature was to consist of one house only, Legislative Council. The Act separated for the first time the provincial and central budgets, with provincial legislatures being authorized to make their budgets. A High Commissioner for India was appointed, who was to hold his office in London for 6 years and whose duty was to look after Indian trade in Europe. Some of the functions hitherto performed by the Secretary of State for India were transferred to the High Commissioner. The Secretary of State for India, who used to get his pay from the Indian revenue, was now to be paid by the British Exchequer, thus undoing an injustice in the Charter Act of 1793. Though Indian leaders for the first time got some administrative experience in a constitutional setup under this act, there was no fulfillment of the demand for responsible government. Though a measure of power devolved on the provinces with such demarcation of subjects between centre and provinces, the structure continued to be unitary and centralized. Diarchy in the provincial sector failed. The central legislature, though more representative than the previous legislative councils and endowed for the first time with power to vote supplies, had no power to replace the government, and even its powers in the field of legislation and financial control were limited and subject to Simon Commission. The overriding powers of the 1919 Act had provided that a Royal Commission would be appointed 10 years after the Act to report on its working. In November 1927, 2 years before the schedule, the British government announced the appointment of such a commission, the Indian Statutory Commission. The commission submitted its report in 1930 and recommended that diarchy be abolished, responsible government be extended in the provinces, a federation of British India and the princely states be established, and that communal electorates be continued. 3 roundtable conferences were called by the British government to consider the proposals. Subsequently, a white paper on constitutional reforms was published by the British government in March 1933. Containing provisions for a federal setup and provincial autonomy. A joint committee of the Houses of the British Parliament was set up under Lord Linlithgow to further consider the scheme. Its report submitted in 1934 said that a federation would be set up if at least 50% of the princely states were ready to join it. The bill prepared on the basis of this report was passed by the British Parliament to become the Government of India Act of 1935. Government of India Act 1935. The Act, with 321 articles and 10 schedules, contemplated the establishment of an All India Federation in which governors, provinces, and the chief commissioners, provinces, and those Indian states which might accede to be united were to be included. The ruler of each princely state willing to join was to sign an instrument of accession mentioning the extent to which authority was to be surrendered to the federal government. Diarchy, rejected by the Simon Commission, was provided for in the federal executive. The federal legislature was to have 2 chambers, bicameral, the Council of States and the Federal Legislative Assembly. The Council of States upper house was to be a permanent body. There was a provision for joint sitting in cases of deadlock between the houses. There were to be three subject lists: the federal legislative list, the provincial legislative list, and the concurrent legislative list. Residuary legislative powers were subject to the discretion of the Governor General. Even if a bill was passed by the federal legislature, the Governor General could veto it, while even acts assented to by the Governor General could be disallowed by the King in Council. Diarchy in the provinces was abolished and provinces were given autonomy. That is, the distinction between the reserved and transferred subjects was abolished and full responsible government was established subject to certain safeguards. Provinces derived their power and authority directly from the British Crown. They were given independent financial powers and resources. Provincial governments could borrow money on their own security. Provincial legislatures were further expanded. Bicameral legislatures were provided in the 6 provinces of Madras, Bombay, Bengal, United Provinces, Bihar, and Assam, with other 5 provinces retaining unicameral legislatures. The principles of communal electorates and weightage were further extended to depressed classes, women, and labor. Franchise was extended with about 10% of the total population getting the right to vote. The Act also provided for a federal court which was established in 1937 with original and appellate powers to interpret the 1935 Act and settle interstate disputes, but the Privy Council in London was to dominate this court. The India Council of the Secretary of State was abolished. The All India Federation was visualized in the Act never came into being because of the opposition from different parties of India. The British government decided to introduce the provincial autonomy on April 1, 1937, but the central government continued to be governed in accordance with the 1919 Act with minor amendments. The operative part of the Act of 1935 remained in force till August 15, 1947. The 1935 Act was an endeavor to give India a written constitution, even though Indians were not involved in its creation, and it was a step towards complete responsible government in India. However, the Act provided a rigid constitution with no possibility of internal growth. Right of amendment was reserved for British Parliament. Extension of the system of communal electorates and representation of various interests promoted separatist tendencies, culminating in the partition of India. The 1935 Act was condemned by nearly all sections and unanimously rejected by the Congress. The Congress demanded instead convening of a Constituent Assembly elected on the basis of adult franchise to frame a constitution for independent India. Various other developments took place after the 1935 Act. There was the August Offer of 1940, the Cripps Proposals of 1942, the CR Formula of 1944, trying to seek the cooperation of the Muslim League, the Wavell Plan of 1945, and the Cabinet Mission. Then came the Mountbatten Plan in 1947, and finally the Indian Independence Act 1947. Like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. Thank you. Bye.